Hello YouTube. Today I will tell you about one of the most interesting cases that I have investigated and Philip Mantle helped me through the years. It has to do with mysterious underwater civilizations. And this case is by no means over. I'm getting new details, and in today's presentation we will find out also what happened in 1932 in relation to this case. And just to let you know that I will stick to the main case, but there are parallel investigations that have been researched by us, and we presented them in the recent book, Russia's USO Secrets. I've received a number of inquiries after first publishing the research back years ago. And this investigation had been translated in a number of languages based on our findings. But it goes on, and I think you'll find it very interesting. It all started as follows. In the summer of 1982, Soviet officer Mark Steinberg, along with Colonel Gennady Zverev, conducted periodic training of the reconnaissance divers or frogmen from the Kyrgyzstan and Central Asian military regions. Some of these training exercises had been taking place at the Issyk-Kul Lake. Please remember the name, Issyk-Kul Lake. Quite unexpectedly, the officers were paid a visit by a very important official from the Soviet Armed Forces, Major General Demenenko, commander of the Military Diver Service of the Engineer Forces of the Ministry of Defense, USSR. He arrived in Central Asia to inform the local officers of an extraordinary event that had occurred during similar training exercises in the Trans-Baikal and West Siberian military regions. During the military training dives in the Lake Baikal, the frogmen had encountered mysterious underwater swimmers, as they called them. Very human-like, except that their size was much larger. They were almost 3 meters tall. I ask that you remember that measurement. The so-called swimmers were dressed in tight, fitting silvery suits, despite icy cold water temperatures. At the depth of 50 meters, these swimmers used neither scuba diving equipment or aqualungs for breathing, nor any other equipment. They only had spherical helmets which concealed their heads. The local military commander, who was quite alarmed by such encounters, decided on a plan to capture one of the creatures. To complete the mission, a special group of 7 divers, under the command of an officer, had been dispatched to the lake. Apparently, as the frogmen tried to cover the creature with a net, the entire group of the frogmen was thrown out of the deep waters to the surface by some powerful unknown force. Now, in those days, the equipment of the frogmen did not allow rapid ascent from such depths without strict adherence to the process of decompression stops. And all of the members of the ill-fated expedition were stricken by air embolism or the Casson disease. The only remedial treatment available consisted of an immediate confinement under decompression conditions in a pressure chamber. They had several such pressure chambers in the military region, but only one was in working condition. This chamber was only built to contain no more than 2 persons at any one time. Without having much choice, the local commanding officer had forced 4 frogmen into the chamber, and as a result, 3 of them, including the leader of the group, perished, and the rest of them became invalids. The Major General rushed to the Issyk-Kul Lake to warn the local military against similar risky operations. Although the Issyk-Kul Lake is shallower than Baikal Lake, the depth of the former seems sufficient to contain similar mysterious creatures. Did the Major General know something that Officer Steinberg did not? It appears we'll never know. A short time later, the staff headquarters of the Turkmenistan military region had received an order from the Commander-in-Chief of the Land Forces of the USSR. The order consisted of a detailed analysis of the Baikal Lake events and reprimands. It was supplemented by an information bulletin from the headquarters of the Engineer Forces of the Ministry of Defense USSR. The bulletin listed numerous deepwater lakes where there had been registered sightings of anomalous phenomena, appearances of unknown underwater creatures similar to the Baikal type, also descent and ascent of giant disks and spheres, and powerful luminescence emanating from the depths of the lakes. Such official documents, without exception, were highly classified and so-called for the eyes only of a very limited circle of military officers. The purpose for such documents was to prevent unnecessary encounters. Now, the territory under the military unit jurisdiction where Steinberg had served contained an anomalous water reservoir, the Sarez Lake, in the Pamir Mountains area, roughly 1.5 kilometers deep. Sarez was visible to those stationed at the tracking point in the Pamir Mountains, and the tracking was of the American SDI, or Star Wars, satellites by Soviet armed forces. Super powerful instruments, equipment, and devices of the Soviet military subunit that had been doing the actual training had repeatedly registered disc-like objects coming in and out of the lake. There is more about this unusual lake in our book. All I can say is that those who reside below the lake should be very concerned. But let's look at the 1982 Baikal Lake case. As I said, I and Philip Mantle have been looking for the confirmation of the so-called swimmer's encounter through the years. And we found a few things. Mikhail Demidenko, a Russian writer who passed away in 2003, read Steinberg's account in 1992. Steinberg published it in some emigre newspapers, and I understand it was picked up in the Soviet Union, former Soviet Union and modern Russia. Demidenko recalled that while on an assignment from the Union of Writers in 1986 in Irkutsk, Siberia, he spent some time at the Baikal Lake. Please remember the city Irkutsk. This city is situated very close to Baikal Lake, along the Trans-Siberian Railway. Demidenko, while he was in the area, had learned from local fishermen that some years before his visit, they observed how Soviet frogmen were propelled out from the lake to 10 or 15 meters up over the water. The locals never found out why the military behaved in that manner. Demidenko thought that it was the same episode that he had read about, so he contacted his sources in the highest echelons of the Russian army, but all to no avail. Finally, the writer did speak with a colonel from the Chief Logistics Directorate who had tried to help him. Demidenko found out from him later that such an order would be kept in special archives that require top secret clearance. Demidenko, as a young man, after graduating from a military college, became a translator and interpreter of the Chinese language. He was dispatched by the General Staff of the Soviet Army to raid China's Air Force headquarters, and he had also served in North Korea during the war. Later, Demidenko traveled through China to western Tibet. When he became a well-known author and scriptwriter in the Soviet Union, He had visited a number of countries in Southeast Asia and Europe. He collected materials to write a number of fascinating books, including Behind the Great Wall, and the last one that he did, По следам СС в Tibet, Following the SS Trail into Tibet. It was published in 1999. Here's what's important to our case. In 1954, Demidенko was accompanying high-ranking Beijing and Soviet military commanders while they inspected Red Chinese troops in Xinjiang province, in the Uyghur Autonomous Region, and western Tibet, where the group actually spent the night in a Lamaist monastery. There, Demidенko met an old monk who was a Russian-speaking Mongol. Among many fascinating subjects, the monk told him of the caves in the Tibetan mountains, where the 3 meters tall giants remained in an anesthesia-induced sleep. One day they can wake up, according to the monk. Later, Demidенko heard stories that the Red Chinese army troops had entered one of these sacred caves, removed from there one of the sleeping amphibian giants, and publicly hanged it. Well, Demidенko had a number of high-placed connections in Asia, East Germany, and the Russian armed forces. As Demidенko's well-researched book demonstrates, the occult-worshipping Nazis were quite aware of the giants and legends of underground cities of Tibet. That is why Hitler sent his SS expeditions to Tibet, as he was certain that these giant demigods would confirm his racial theories. There is more information regarding the giants in his books, and a wealth of other historical information about Hitler's expeditions, archives, and mysterious events. Those who need more information can contact me directly. Now, let me describe Lake Baikal to you and some of the strange phenomena. The Republic of Buryatia is located in central part of the continent of Asia. The Republic is almost as large as the country of Germany. It is bounded by Irkutsk and Chita regions, Republic of Tuva, and Mongolia, and is bordered by one of the greatest and magnificent lakes in the world, Lake Baikal. According to the Buryat legends, Lake Baikal has no bottom. The lake is connected with all the oceans, seas, and rivers. In the depths of it is a silver castle of Erlik Khan, or the rule of destinies. In 1904, there were numerous UFO reports in the Lake Baikal area. Black objects with searchlights in the sky, objects with strange wheels that rotated and opened multicolored lights, cigar-shaped objects with signal lights. There were reports about objects that performed complex maneuvers and apparently landed as well. There were those who worked for the Trans-Baikal Railroad that also reported mysterious spheres with rotating searchlights. Philip and I were not the only ones that wanted to solve the mystery of the mysterious underwater humanoids. But until recent times, we didn't know about the other investigator. Russian historian and writer Alexei Ivanenko resides in the city of Ulan-Ude of the Buryatia Republic, and he has researched the history of the Siberian lake and its strange phenomena. He also learned of the story of the swimmers and has more information that confirms the events of 1982. And also years ago, the historian found a report about UFO landing. It was printed in the official bulletin of the Commission for Anomalous Phenomena. You can find out more about this commission in our books. Quite fascinating. Now, there is a story well known to the inhabitants of Buryatia. On one of the mountains surrounding the Kudara Samon settlement, a manned apparatus had landed. Humanoid beings dressed in shining spacesuits exited that craft. Some locals, among them a district militia or police officer on a motorcycle, set out to the UFO landing site. But when they approached, the object flew towards Mongolia. Tivanenko found out that there are connections between the 1990 landing incident with the 1982 case of the so-called swimmers. Now, he doesn't mention the year, but he states that local fishermen exchanged disturbing stories that in different sections of the lake they are sometimes scared by some anthropoid creatures in shiny suits. Like dolphins, those creatures jump out of water around the fishing boats. One fisherman, Nikolai Kireev, showed Tivanenko the spot in the southern Baikal where he and his comrades from Kultuk settlement witnessed a stunning phenomenon. When the fishermen in the evening arrived at the fishing location near the Krugo-Baikalskaya railroad, they were met by several such swimmers in metallic-looking suits. Tivanenko imagined the fear of the people who observed human dolphins, seemingly playfully jumping from the depths of the lake in the evening darkness, and then noiselessly diving back underwater. The beings were 3 meters tall. The Kultuk fishermen dropped their nets and fled home on their motorboat while being chased by mysterious creatures. The depth in the fishing spot is 1400 meters. The fishermen never returned there. Nikolai Kireev generally abandoned night fishing for good. And here is something rather strange. Tivanenko revealed that he met the other witnesses from the same group of fishermen and talked with them, and continued to do so until they suddenly started dying, one by one. But the story doesn't end here. Tivanenko invited Kireev to meet with the scientists from the 3-year-long deep-water expedition in the Baikal Lake aboard the Mir vessels. This was an international project, and the scientists were limnologists. Limnology is the study of inland waters. It is often regarded as a division of ecology or environmental science. The deep submergence research vehicles, or mini submarines Mir 1 and Mir 2, researched the bottom of Lake Baikal from 2008-2009. I think they were also looking for gold that's reported to be down there, and that's a different subject we'll not get into. What's interesting is that on August 1, 2009, there was a descent to the bottom of the Lake Baikal aboard Mir 1 mini submarine by Prime Minister of Russia Vladimir Putin, and the depth of his descent was 1,400 meters. Nikolai Kireev repeated his tale to the scientists that were ready to begin exploration of the lake in the area of the incident. But there were some other people who also wanted to hear what Kireev had to say. They were rescuers from the MHS, or that's abbreviation for the Ministry of the Russian Federation for Civil Defense, Emergencies and Elimination of Consequences of Natural Disasters. And these people were from the Irkutsk section of the MHS. They revealed to Tivanenko that not long ago their colleagues recently actually were surrounded underwater by some humanoid fish beings in spacesuits. When the rescuers tried to put their nets around one of the creatures to capture it, some unknown force threw the rescuers out of the lake waters. They also mentioned that the minister, Sergei Shoigu, instructed that the Mir submersibles be used to study the area of the underwater encounter with the alien beings, with the Earthlings. The scientists were skeptical but still careful looking into the portholes and listening to the noises outside the submersibles. But they did not encounter any mysterious swimmers. Now, Tivanenko prepared for the next season of the deep water research by getting information about the underwater encounters with aliens that he could obtain. But by that time, he also read Mark Steinberg's article about the 1982 case. It was published in the Russian emigre newspapers in New York. I should add something that mine and Philip Mantel's research was published in the book Mysterious Sky in 2005. And of course, people in Russia knew about it. It was well known. And quite possibly that those who guarded Russian security and safety knew about our research and books. Everything is out in the open. And I'm sure that they would not miss the chance to study Baikal for the mysterious creatures. But I also have no doubts that they have their own sources of information and know possibly much more than we can collect in the open sources. Now, Tivanenko did find out more. The Irkutsk MHS rescuers assigned to the deepwater expedition of the manned Mir submersibles explained to him that the encounter with the Baikal underwater humanoids indeed took place in the area of the northern Baikal during the joint exercises with the military. So, from Tivanenko's information, I understand that, firstly, the modern Irkutsk rescuers from MHS knew about the 1982 case in the USSR. Okay? And secondly, a similar incident took place when they attempted to capture mysterious swimmers years later. Tivanenko recalled the meeting he had in 1982-1983 in the summertime with the military personnel stationed in the Barguzinsky Bay. He asked them questions about the reason for their Baikal research, and they responded that they study the depths of the Siberian lake and that the limnologists do not know nearly enough about the underwater life there. Tivanenko recalls that it would have been logical for him to see Navy personnel among the military, but he saw military engineers of the land-based forces of the Soviet Army. So that confirms Steinberg's report. Also, the conflict of the Soviet frogmen with the swimmers took place in the northern Baikal. Then, if that's the case, who did the Kultuk fishermen encounter in the southern part of the lake? Or did the humanoid creatures of the unknown origin occupy the inaccessible depths of the entire lake in Siberia? Tivanenko also recalls that a group of Moscow ufologists with the NTV television company arrived at Baikal, certain that local fishermen sometimes observe descending and ascending into and from Lake Baikal UFOs, various saucers, and spheres of different sizes, and that allegedly there is a concealed underwater alien base. The aliens do not want to contact the Earthlings, considering the inhabitants of Earth to be subhuman. And those captains of vessels in the lake even observe some strange luminescence in the body of water that resembles searchlights and is accompanied by terrifying extraterrestrial sounds. A little later, I'll describe another encounter with the similar humanoids in the USSR and how the scientist who was rescued by them described the creatures. It's quite different from the view that the Moscow TV consultants had. Now, by now we know that various Russian TV channels have read our books, mine and Philip's, and they have contacted us as well. Some are quite persistent, but apparently they also read Tivanenko's articles and books. Now, according to him, UFOs have been observed over Baikal during the last 2 centuries. There are reports in the 19th century newspapers as well as in the ancient legends of the Buryat people. Let us take one example. The Irkutsk Chronicles of N.S. Romanov, dating back to 1884. It contains a description of a gigantic glowing sphere with numerous portholes over Lake Baikal. There were numerous eyewitnesses of the phenomenon. At that time, there were no airplanes, dirigibles, blimps, or meteorological balloons in the area that could have been mistaken for UFOs. Tivanenko and other people who live in the area of Lake Baikal frequently observe UFOs over the lake and over Buryatia. For example, in the autumn of 1965, a gigantic cigar-shaped glowing object flew across Baikal, leaving behind a typical inversion layer, as a jet aircraft would. But absolutely no sounds of any jet engines were heard. The size of the UFO was estimated to be around 250 meters. While approaching the Hamar Badan mountain range, the UFO dispatched 3 small radiant spheres from its bottom part. They were of yellow, pink, and blue colors, and they flew in different directions at the same speed as the cigar-shaped object. Those who watch my videos should take a look again at the 1953 case in Siberia. I think they'll find some interesting correlations. Tivanenko also was referred to in an article published in People newspaper in July of 2009 in Russia. The article described recent sightings of orange spheres over the lake. They moved noiselessly, approaching each other and then departing. A reader later commented in the internet edition that he had observed the UFOs on the very same Saturday as Tivanenko did. The UFOs followed one another and glowed like searchlights at altitudes much lower than those of satellites. Also, unlike satellites, the objects vanished instantly. He had observed similar objects in previous years. Russia's USO Secrets, our book, has more fascinating reports from the Lake Baikal area, including the deadly 1964 attack on the Soviet anti-aircraft unit by unexplained phenomenon. But let's press on with the swimmers case. We need to look at the Seka connection. There was a case of the so-called Issyk-Kul giant, which may have a direct connection to the mysterious swimmers. It was researched by the secret Soviet UFO research program, Seka, which lasted from 1978 to 1991, and I mentioned it in my previous videos. Eduard Yermilov, a distinguished Russian scientist in the prestigious Radiophysics Science Research Institute, had been involved with the Seka program, and he investigated the 1982 case that very likely involved a similar humanoid giant. Borisogledsk, located in the Voronezh region, is one of the most active areas of UFO sightings, according to Plaksin, an expert with the Defense Ministry of the Russian Federation, and a former leading participant of the Seka program. And I mention him once in a while. He mentioned also that a special military commission was created in the 1980s specifically to study the UFOs in the area. The objects sighted and reported by military observers varied in size from a tennis ball to 200 meters long object, and they maneuvered at speeds ranging from 0 to 600 kilometers per hour at altitudes from 0 to 20 kilometers above Earth. Eduard Yermilov, who was a scientist from Gorky at the time, reported that on May 26 of 1982, during the loss of communications with the MiG-21 aircraft and its subsequent crash, a UFO was observed in the area. at an altitude of 1500 meters. A search and recovery operation was organized. On May 27, the search team, comprised of Junior Sergeant Panikov and Private Kunin, while in the Pavarino area forest, walked into a clearing where they observed a humanoid entity. The entity was no less than 3.5 meters tall, dressed in silvery clothing which had a greenish tint to it. After the creature fled the site of the incident, the eyewitnesses observed an explosion behind the trees. And a luminous object took off, leaving a glowing trail behind as it disappeared behind the trees. This most curious episode was confirmed by Colonel Kolchin in his book Phenomenon НЛО Взгляд из России, or UFO Phenomenon, A View from Russia, which was published in 1997. Now, Yermilov was also told of the strange Borisogledsk aircraft breakdowns, and he told it to German Kolchin and Arvid Mordvin-Shadro. At the time, there were chiefs of the Leningrad Commission for Anomalous Phenomena of the Geographic Society of the USSR. As our research continued, it came to no surprise to learn that the swimmers have not disappeared from Russia's waters. The Russian newspaper Komsomolskaya Pravda carried an article by Pavlov in its December 1st, 2000 issue. The article described how a close relationship had developed between local Russian military commanders and UFO researchers, among them Dr. Dvuzhilny, famous for the research of the Dalnygorsk crash case. Among the documents provided by the commander of the Far Eastern Air Defense District to local ufologists, there was one that mentioned an interesting case from 1990. Again, remember this year, 1990. A military brigade at the Timofeevka settlement was dispatched due to an alarm raised by a sentry who fired a warning shot. The sentry observed two beings, both wearing silvery overalls. They were about 2.5 meters tall, according to him, and they came from a nearby oak grove. Right after the warning shot, the silvery ones, as he described them, immediately ran back into the oak trees area. The soil was wet because of a recent rain, and the Russian counterintelligence officers who came to the site discovered large footprints of huge, shapeless feet. There have been other fascinating reports of sightings of creatures that may be those mysterious swimmers. Russian journalist Alexander Volodyev published his article Lords of the World's Oceans in the newspaper Интересная Gazeta in 2011. The information of interest to me and Philip in his article has to do with the July 1932 case of the man who was saved by mysterious rulers of the oceans. A Soviet scientific expedition landed on the shores of the White Sea. Among them was David Gershon, an ichthyologist, 34 years old at the time. 10 years later, in 1942, he perished defending Leningrad from Nazi invaders. But he left a manuscript behind for his daughters. The unfinished book was titled Meetings with the Future. One of the completed chapters in the manuscript told the story of a scientist, himself, who fell off a cliff into the sea due to his carelessness. The scientist was pulled almost to the bottom by either an underwater current or turbulent whirlpool streams. Gershon, however, was saved by underwater gigantic human beings. He really considered himself to be lucky because, according to his words, he got confirmation of what he had previously considered to be fairy tales. Gershon did not remember how they pulled him from the water, how he found his way into the closed, brightly illuminated areas full of technical devices of unknown purpose. But he did remember benign giants in silvery suits, anatomically identical to human beings. They had no fishtails, no fins, but they could breathe at great depths because they possessed gills. Down there, the giants tended to the plantations of edible seaweeds, hunted, and also produced oil. Gershon insisted that his rescuers were fully informed about the state of affairs in the world and were completely fluent in Russian. They brought him to the camp a week later aboard a speedy capsule, but categorically refused to speak to his colleagues or others. But they did permit him to inform the inhabitants of the land about the way the giants live. They knew how to obtain the energy, metals, and oxygens by nuclear fission of the water. They explained to the Soviet scientists that the future of mankind is in the exploration of the oceans and their depths, because the mineral riches down below are inexhaustible. Apparently, the Russian journalist Volodyev knew about similar cases, and I'm trying to locate him. As for Gershon, considering the life in the Soviet Union under Stalin and that period with the building of concentration camps and early purges of Soviet scientists and others, probably Gershon decided not to share his explanations and guidance he received from the underwater creatures that saved his life. I am just a little bit amazed by his reference to the stories that he had knew before, which he called fairy tales, but I just don't have enough information to go on. But there is another interesting report from the same area and it has to do, it was 50 years later after Gershon's story. There was a hand glider, Polivayev, who was hand gliding over the Kavgolovo area in the early 1990s. That's in the Leningrad region or St. Petersburg. There are lakes in the area, and in one of them, the skydiver noticed 3 giant fish. He descended and was able to see that the swimmers were in silvery costumes. That's how he called them. He mentioned the episode in Letuchi Golandets publication in 1995. There also have been many reported UFO sightings in the same area. Whether there is a connection between the UFO sightings and the strange creatures, we cannot say. There have been other sightings. For example, Borovikov had hunted Black Sea sharks for many years. Something happened to this fisherman that abruptly put an end to his hobby. Diving in the Anapa area, Black Sea, he descended to the depth of 8 meters. He told how he observed gigantic beings rising up from down below. They were milky white but with humanoid faces, and now in this case something that resembled fishtails. The creature that was swimming ahead of its companions noticed Borovikov and stopped. It had giant bulging eyes, which seemed to focus directly on him. The other 2 giant beings joined the first one. The first one waved its hand. It was definitely a hand with membranes between the fingers, and he waved it towards the diver. All of them approached the diver and stopped at a short distance from him. Then they turned around and simply swam away. Borovikov's experience was published in the book «20 век. Хроника необъяснимого», or 20th Century, the Chronicle of the Inexplicable, in Moscow in 1996. Now let's look at other territories that comprise the USSR and mysterious underwater giants there. Boris Grabovsky, a Soviet engineer, who by the way invented the first fully electronic TV set, in the late 1930s conducted an intriguing interview with a reluctant witness to one episode from our planet's mysterious past. That man and his friends had once explored a cave near Lake Issyk-Kul, located in Kyrgyzstan. Inside the cave, the man discovered three human skeletons, each more than 3 meters tall. The skeletons were adorned with decorations that looked like bats, meaning flying mammals, made from silver. The man became very scared and kept silent about their discovery for many years. They did melt down the silver decorations, and a small piece had been saved. Soviet scientists who had studied that piece said that they could not determine its age. What is interesting is that there is a Kyrgyz legend that does mention a submerged city in the Issyk-Kul Lake. The city's ruler was a creature with long asinine ears. Now, Lake Issyk-Kul, which means the hot lake in the Turkic language of the Central Asia, is one of the largest alpine lakes in the world. And the Trans-Ili Alatau and the Tersky Alatau mountain ranges stretch along the north shore of this huge deep water lake. There are two mountain ranges of the Tian Shan south of the lake. They are separated by the valley that stretches in the same direction. That's interesting because from the days of antiquity, the shores of the lake and its waters have kept many secrets and mysteries. There are caves of Stone Age people, burial mounds of ancient nomads and Scythian kings, open-air temples, many strange rock drawings, ruins of long-forgotten cities, and remnants of lost civilizations that are buried underwater. Just briefly, here are some examples of observations from Issyk-Kul area. The year of one of them is relevant to the research conducted by Tivanenko and some other reports that Philip and I have from the Annals of Soviet Ufology. In February of 1990, in the Aksu Gorge near the Issyk-Kul Lake, local shepherds observed a large sphere at the distance of 700 meters. The sphere separated into 4 parts that flew off in different directions, only to rejoin half a minute later. This was repeated 3 times, and afterwards the sphere flew towards the lake. This report was published in well-known researchers whose name, by the way, was Mikhail Yeltsin, but no relationship to the former leader of Russia. And the book was published in 1992. It was about UFOs. And by the way, on June 20, 1990, the expedition of the Sakufon UFO research organization from Central Asia was on its way to the Tian Shan Mountains. It was on the Sino-Soviet border. It was comprised of scientists, military personnel, civilians, KGB officers, and ufologists. The times were new in the Soviet Union in 1990, so you could see joint research like that. 2 eyewitnesses, both members of the expeditions, observed a triangular UFO at the Issyk-Kul Lake. The object moved at a low altitude and then turned around and simply vanished. The UFO had bright luminescent lights. Its altitude was about 20 meters, and later it flew over the main group of the expedition. Now, those are just 2 examples of the many UFO and UFO sightings that have been reported from the Issyk-Kul Lake area, and many of which are similar to observations made in other Soviet lakes and seas. The earliest Eurasian mention of similar gigantic beings dates back to the early 1900s. Several boys in the country of Georgia, at that time part of the Russian Empire, discovered a cave inside a mountain which was allegedly full of humanoid skeletons. Each skeleton was about 3 meters tall. To get to the cave, the boys had to dive into a lake. George Papashvili and his wife recalled the incident in a book published in New York in 1945. The title of the book was Anything Can Happen. George Papashvili was born in the Russian Empire. He immigrated to the United States in 1922, and he married an American, and who became his co-author of many books. And actually, there was a movie made in 1952 in Hollywood based on the sculptor's life. But perhaps the explanation to the mysteries of the underwater's gigantic humanoids can be found in ancient India. Our hypothesis is presented in Russia's UFO Secrets. We have exchanged research notes with Indian scientists and researchers after we studied all available information from ancient Vedic mythology of India, as well as Mahabharata, about the quite large population of the celestial race of the Davana, so-called demons, that lived in the depths of the oceans. It is a very detailed research. It describes the weapons used, the main players, the warfare, as well as the direct connections to Lake Baikal and other bodies of water. We believe that some of the so-called underwater demons managed to escape and have operated in the oceans, seas, rivers, and lakes of our planet. And it looks like our interest is shared by a number of people in Russia and quite possibly in other nations. So stay tuned, because this investigation is by no means over. Thank you.